Hey, one more thing before you go. In this transformative episode, I have a conversation with a psychedelic guide and somatic womb healer who delves into the profound realms of psychedelics, cyclical living, and womb reconnection. Join us as we share an invaluable insight gained from overcoming anxiety, depression, PTSD, burnout, grief, alcohol abuse, and eating disorders. I'm your host, Michael Hurst. Welcome to One More Thing Before You Go. My guest in this episode is Leslie Draffman. She's a certified integrative somatic psychedelic guide, a menstrual cycle coach, a meditation teacher, feminine embodiment mentor, and podcast host. She's passionate about helping people embrace their bodies, cycles, and psychedelics. She supports conscious women and menstruators who want to heal themselves through intentional microdosing, psychedelic integration, womb reconnection, and cyclical living. She believes sacred earth medicine has the power to bring us home to ourselves, awaken our authenticity, and heal the trauma locked within our subconscious. Leslie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
What an absolutely amazing opportunity for people to take a look within themselves.
That's what I'm here for, helping you see inside.
It's an amazing journey too that you've got, come through in order to get where you're at this moment. I think that, we all have a journey in life. Sometimes we take paths that we regret later on or want to change later on. I regret walking in front of the car that hit me, but I learned things from it. And I also, took me an opportunity to kind of gain knowledge from it, move forward with it and understand, don't do that again. Because it hurt. But I like to, you getting into this journey with psychedelics, I think is a really interesting, it's a unique approach to healing. I believe in holistic healing, 100%. I've done it myself. And as my listener, my audience knows, I've had a journey with this. I have rheumatoid arthritis, severe rheumatoid arthritis, actually, from everything I've been through. I don't use any medication. Only food and herbs and meditation and exercise and things like that. And, I feel so much better about it. So first and foremost, I really am grateful that you're presenting these opportunities. I love the word opportunity to individuals to see it from a holistic perspective, a naturopathic perspective as well, so that they can move forward and improve their lives. But I'd like to start at the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in South Carolina in two very conservative towns. My dad is a preacher and I was adopted. So the first town I lived in was called Clover, and it was a bigger town than the one that I moved to when I was 12, where Due West was the second town. It was about 500 people. So I was definitely a small town girl for sure, and a very conservative, very Christian upbringing.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably had I will say, a conversation in your home with regard to your approaches.
There have been some conversations, but not that many. I think my family and my parents specifically are kind of one of those, like, we just don't want to look at it. We wish her the best. We love her, but we don't need to know all the things, because I certainly started with menstrual cycle specific, helping women with their cycles, and then kind of spread into sex and now psychedelics. And that's not the comfiest conversation to have with my mom and dad.
Yeah, I can understand that. Being the father of two young women, I definitely understand that.
Yeah.
It works. Did you go to school, go to university?
Yeah, I actually went to the University of South Carolina for broadcast journalism and spent 15 years in TV before I left. After many different things happened, but I left in 2022, sort of because of the things that you mentioned before: anxiety, depression, burnout. And, for me, I think what was really a pivotal part of my life was a freshman year of college when I was diagnosed with herpes. I had had sex for the first time, and a couple of weeks later got this diagnosis that really sent me into a massive shame spiral. That led me to getting even deeper into my eating disorders, abusing alcohol, using drugs like Adderall to lose even more weight and just disconnect and numb out from my feelings for probably about 12 years. And at the same time, what was interesting as I look back, right, because hindsight is always 2020, another thing I did to cope was overachieve. And so I made straight A's and I got a really great job and I did really good work in 15 years in journalism, and I was great at my job and was making six figures and all of this outside. Everyone looking at me from the outside would think I had it all together and that I had it all, when in reality I felt so stuck and so apart from who I knew that I really was.
You know, it is. I think a lot of us, from my old profession, you know, I saw and understood from my own upbringing. You know, we all see what happens in the real world, but we also don't know what always happens behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. And you know, when I say that, theoretically and realistically, you know, whether it be our mind closed door or the actual front door. Mm-hmm. And you know, sometimes it takes a little bit of introspect to be able to understand that. You know, this isn't right, or I just need to change, or I need to make a lifestyle change, or make some form of change in my life to be able to step out of what I think is a downward spiral in any form. Would you agree?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think looking at my own life and where I am now, there were certainly like these like pivotal moments that really continued to point me in the direction that I needed to go. But because I'd had a decade plus of not listening to my intuition, not even understanding what that was, not understanding how to trust myself because I was so disconnected and upset and angry at my body and at God, that it took a lot of things for the universe to finally like steer me onto the path, because I was veering everywhere.
Yeah, I'm sure. What can you help us understand what was let me see if I get to the right question. Kind of what was the light coming on? Mm. What was your first notion as to, hey, things have to kind of change, I need to look at something different?
You know, I went through a really messy divorce in my late 20s and went to therapy. And I think my counselor was really great at helping me become aware of things like Buddhism. And she even told me, you know, we talked about Judaism and things of like other world religions, because I had spent my 20s so, you know, disconnected from my faith whatsoever. And I just felt so sinful for getting divorced, even though my dad was like, you have to divorce this guy. My dad, the preacher, but it was sitting in her office and reading books that really helped me to understand that there was more out there. And so I think that was one turning point. But at the very same time, I was still drinking heavily every single day, having very risky sexual encounters. And so it wasn't until a few years later in 2019 that I finally had what I call my spiritual awakening. And I was 32 years old, sitting underneath the full moon in January of 2019. And I felt for the very first time this like light start to come on within me. And I had just very recently started a meditation practice and was learning all about meditation and embodiment, crystals, the gateway drug to all spiritual paths, crystals, astrology, tarot, all of those things. And so I think that was really what started to put me on the path, but I was still really struggling with my physical self, still drinking, still feeling like, you know, I couldn't get out of this anxiety and depression that I was in, no matter what I tried, even though I was still in therapy and at times was taking medications prescribed by doctors for those exact same things.
Yeah, I think that I had to smile when you said crystals, the gateway drug to the. My wife, she has a whole slew of crystals. I'm gonna have to tell her that. Yeah, I've never heard that before, and it's kind of cool. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I think that sometimes when I grew up with, in not necessarily comparison, but I grew up with two alcoholic parents, and in growing up with two alcoholic parents, I kind of did the same thing. I set myself outside of that environment for a little bit, and part of it was trying to overachieve, and I still catch myself following that path occasionally. My wife will come in and say, "You need to take a break. You need to take a break," and it's like, "I got to get this done. Got to get this done." And I think we all, as human beings, are innately responsible for ourselves to recognize, take a breath and kind of recognize when something isn't quite, I would say, right within our body, our mind, and our soul. I believe in our body, mind, and soul have to be connected. And sometimes there's a disconnect within that. And I think that you may have started to kind of really understand that. Have you, growing up in the family that you did, in this, and I'm trying to put you on the spot or anything, but growing up in the family that you did, were you really religious before you kind of went
Oh
around the
yeah.
block?
Oh yeah. Definitely. I was at church multiple times a week. We lived next to the church, like in the church's house. I was a good little Christian soldier. Like I
Yeah.
was so preachy
Hey.
as a preacher's daughter, and like so judgmental. And I look back at myself and I think, damn, like, wow, there were so many different versions of me that have happened in this lifetime that I think I had to go through to be who I am now.
Yeah.
But certainly very, very devout, very religious, and a lot of it, very fear based. Like sitting in church on Sunday, thinking of all the things I had done the past week that were
Yeah.
sin, and praying at night, like, please forgive me so I don't go to hell. And just like, I just remember, like, I could feel it in my chest, like that feeling of just terror and
Yeah.
shame.
And that creates its own anxiety and its own PTSD within itself. I grew up Catholic. I'm no longer a practicing Catholic. I haven't been a practicing Catholic for a long time because same principles. My parents got divorced, and then my mother was excommunicated from the church, so she couldn't bring even us kids to the church. And I felt that that was very hypocritical in regard to. I won't go off on that, but hypocritical in regard to you're supposed to be there to help people through things.
Yeah.
I'm divorced. I was married to a woman. We're still friends. My wife and I and my family are still friends with my ex-wife. We just felt that it wasn't working, and we were two individuals that needed a different pathway. And my current wife I've been with 35 years, and we've got two kids. Two beautiful, intelligent young women. Who thrive in society. And my ex-wife has got a son that is an intelligent, strong young man that he's married and she's got a grandkid. And if we'd have been together, we would have had that.
Right.
So I was always told that like you did, you kind of felt, oh, I got divorced, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, I'm going to go to hell, and then I kind of went, no, I don't think so. Look what I have now, and
Mhm.
we have that for a reason. My ex-wife has it for a reason, and so forth. So I became more spiritual. I became
Yes.
more thinking along the lines that the universe exists for us to be able to work together as human beings, and that we are all connected in one way or another across this vast universe, and that we're here to help each other along and to move each other forward,
Mhm.
and that God, and for those of you out there, whether you call him God or Allah or whoever, power to be, him, her, whatever it happens to be, I believe that there is a source up there
Mhm.
that I say you still see my hands, but you can't see my hands. There's still a source up there, that's helping guiding us where we need to be. Um, so in your journey through understanding, you started to recognize things like the depression and
Mhm.
I'm sure you had some anger and some resentment and things like that. How did you first start working through that, if I can ask?
Yeah. I think at first, and I'll answer that question in a minute too, but I would love to circle back to one thing you had just said. Because when I was in my spiritual awakening, the first thing I started to do after so many years of not really practicing anything was to start to connect with earth, to start connecting with female deities. Because for me, so much of my shame was tied up in being a woman and tied up in what had happened to me sexually. And so when it came to my anger and it came to my grief, so much grief. I did not understand that that was what was under there. I thought that, okay, I'm pretty happy. I'm pretty, like, I would say I was very stable. Even with anxiety and depression, I just always kind of felt flat. And so when I started to connect with meditation, connect with female deities through several different pantheons, and finally understand that I'm a witch, I could figure out and see, okay, what's under all of this is insane amounts of grief because of this core wounding around feeling worthy and feeling lovable. And so I started with journaling. I went back to therapy. And like I said, I was still at this point taking anxiety medication, sometimes intermittently. But nothing for me really started to shift until I came off of hormonal birth control in 2020 and started finally reconnecting with my female cycle. Because I think because I had been on hormonal birth control for 16 years, that was what was keeping me very flat. And yes, while coming off of the pill did create a roller coaster for a lot of things, including my hormones, it finally allowed me to feel the peaks and the valleys, which are life. And I think once I opened myself to feeling the pain and the anger and the sadness and the grief, I finally could feel joy. And through another few years, and then finally finding psychedelic mushrooms, I've really started to cohesively come back together, mind, body, soul, and spirit, into who I am now.
That's a wonderful journey. I mean, I would say congratulations and well done for doing that. As an individual, especially coming from where you've come from and what you've gone through. I think society. I worked domestic violence task force in specific for about 4 years. I worked it throughout my career in law enforcement anyway, but as calls. But I worked a task force in specific to it, and it gave me a more of an eye opener as to how women are treated, unfortunately, across this country and across this world. And I think that with that in mind, that where you've come from and where you're at right now, you've accomplished quite a bit. I mean, obviously, it is a victory, no matter which direction you may even think or look at it. It's a victory, and it was a choice, and I'm happy that you made that choice. I think that we wouldn't be having this conversation, I think, if you hadn't made that choice. So,
no, not at all.
I appreciate that. It's. I'm sure it's hard also, I think, to recognize that, because the way society and culture have developed themselves, especially in the United States, and unfortunately more so today, where it seems that they're going backwards. If somebody needs to recognize something that they need to make kind of a lifestyle change in regard to that and themselves, what would you recommend to them?
If they start feeling like they need to change, something needs to change?
Yeah.
It's really hard to answer that question. I think that the first clue is usually this internal knowing that there is something more for me than this. And that was certainly me. Like, I just remember throwing my hands up and being like, there has got to be something more than this. Then feeling like blah, then feeling like everything that I am is tied into this role that I felt I was playing. Like, I very much thought I was playing a TV news anchor on TV. Like, that was this identity that I had, but also this part of me that felt so separate from what I truly am here to do and who I really am. And so if you feel that division between maybe what you're doing and what you feel like you're meant to do, that's probably a really good first sign that you're on the path, that you're awakening. And then if all hell breaks loose and your life starts to fall apart, that's also usually a sign. That was very much me in 2022. I've had multiple dark nights of the soul. That was one of them. And it was, for me, looking back, I'll explain it this way. I had been going through life like I was driving down a mountain road, and it was very curvy. And there were all those signs. It was like, hey, slow down. There's a huge curve ahead. Hey, slow down. Slow down. And like first it's like just a little yellow sign that maybe has like a curve. And then you go a couple miles and it's maybe like a blinking yellow sign. And then you go a little bit farther, you still have not slowed down or paid any attention. And you might get like the rumble tracks or whatever. Like there are so many signs until for me, I still didn't slow down and I plunged right off of that cliff. And so I look back and think, wow, if I had just listened and adjusted course when the signs were back there, maybe I wouldn't have had to go through, the intense amounts of anxiety and depression and burnout that caused me to leave my job. But I also say that everything happens to us for us. And so again, if your life is currently falling apart, it could be a sign that maybe you're actually coming back together.
I agree with that. That works out really well. What brought you to? I mean, sometimes we have to open our eyes and our ears to really kind of understand the signs that you just spoke about. I like the analogy
Yes.
that you put with the mountain pass and going down in coming from just the curvy sign, the snake, and then to the flashing sign, like, hey, I'm talking to you. Are you talking to me? I'm talking to you. And then on down the road till you finally kind of hopefully will open up some more avenues for you to realize that there's a better opportunity for you to move forward. I have to ask you this because I've, as a cop, I've dealt with arresting people with magic mushrooms. It's a
Yeah.
long time ago. I don't have anything against it. I understand that they're using psychedelics now for people with PTSD, especially soldiers and cops and firefighters and EMTs who have PTSD, and they've shown amazing progress with these individuals to help them to deal with all of those opportunities, the post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can help me validate this to everybody out there. You don't have to be a soldier or a firefighter or a cop or a doctor or an EMT to have PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is for anybody that's been through a traumatic event within their life that has a negative effect on their life and continues to affect it in an adverse way. That's post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's something that that needs to be addressed to help you walk the path to coming out of that. So what brought you to psychedelics?
I first heard about psychedelics on a podcast, which is fascinating because here we are talking about it on a podcast. And I immediately invited the woman onto my show. And then the second I hung up my interview with her, I hired her as my coach because she had this way of explaining this medicine like it was like I believe it is a sacred, sentient medicine that is here and has been used for millennia to allow us to work through the things that are keeping us stuck, our wounds and our blocks. And for me, I very much first wanted to work with the mushrooms because of like symptom relief. And for me, my big symptom was that after I quit birth control, my libido just went out the window. And so I wanted to start working on becoming more open to receiving. Obviously, I'd had all that sexual shame based on my herpes diagnosis that I really needed to work through. And I was in an incredibly loving relationship at that point. And I wanted to see if the mushrooms could help me be open to receiving pleasure. And the mushrooms will not give you what you want necessarily. They will give you what you need. And so what they heard was that I needed to become open to receiving. I had spent so much of my life white knuckling things and trying to control things and being in my masculine energy that they needed me to experience some deep, dark stuff so that I could finally just like put my hands out and be like, just like, help me. I trust you. I trust you. And so that's sort of how I found them. I worked with a coach for several months in addition to being in therapy. And I think that was such a wonderful combination. And also I notice now so many people that I work with and myself included, the medicine, the mushrooms picked up where for me talk therapy stopped working. I'm a very intellectual person and I'm great at talking about my trauma. And I would have these conversations with my therapist where they would be like, wow, it's like talking to a colleague. I'm like, well, why do I still feel like crap when I leave here? I do not understand. Like, how can I verbalize and how can I intellectualize and be so self-aware and yet still so stuck? And that's why I knew I needed to try something different, something radically different, because the medicine hadn't worked, psychiatrist hadn't worked, therapist hadn't worked. And so let's go back to earth. I was already deeply within my spiritual practice at this point. And while I had to do a lot of work around the stigma internalized about drugs being bad, because I still had very much the good girl in me that wanted to like follow the rules, and I was still a news anchor at this point, I ultimately came to the decision that for me and my journey, this was worth a try because I was just so sick of everything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, well, let me do this first, if I can, please. We said psychedelics. We said magic mushrooms. Help us understand what magic mushrooms are and where they
Yeah.
come from, so they know
Yes.
what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That they're not man-made. It is nature-made.
Yeah. Yes. So there are many different types of psychedelics. The ones I work with almost exclusively are magic mushrooms. So these are certain species and strains of mushrooms, usually the Psilocybe cubensis strain, and there are at least 180 different types of those mushrooms around the world. Here in the States, a lot of the ones that people ingest are native to Central and South America, but they're also sometimes found along the Pacific Northwest. And so these are psychedelic compounds that when you eat them, do produce things like hallucinations, body sensations, and I'm talking at high levels. But the way that I mostly ingest these mushrooms is at a tiny micro level called microdosing. And at those tiny little levels, we're talking a tenth to a 20th of what folks would ingest to have these full, big, trippy journeys, the very much like the hippie trippy journeys of like the 60s. At these tiny micro levels, they do not produce any visual changes. They don't produce any hallucinations. They don't make you feel drunk. They don't make you intoxicated. And instead, what they do is start to work at this very beautiful level in your subconscious and in your body to make you feel things like maybe more focused or alert, maybe more calm, and mostly, from what I have experienced, much more open, so that you can open that door into your subconscious and start looking at the things hidden in the shadows and really begin to unpack layer by layer, like peeling that onion, all of these oftentimes limiting beliefs and blocks and wounds that are covering up your true essence.
Now,
That's what they are.
is there something that you have to? I mean, do they work with meditation? Do you have to meditate, or is that a bonus to be able to meditate? Something along that line.
So we've seen some really amazing studies by Johns Hopkins and Harvard showing that meditation and psilocybin or microdosing like are a beautiful combination because it can help you become so open and so much more focused. But I don't think that you have to meditate along with a microdosing or a psychedelic mushroom practice. I usually encourage people, women that I work with, to get into their body through things like dance, walking, being in the sun, grounding, sensual pleasure. And even, I was actually talking about this on social media this morning. I think it's really supportive for people who run their own businesses because it encourages you to take care of yourself. And when you're a small business owner, like that's a really tough thing to remember to do. And I really just feel like when I think about mushrooms, magic mushrooms, I see them as these little teachers, that grow from the earth that allow us to meet our true selves. And in other indigenous cultures, for instance, in Mexico, there was a woman named Maria Sabina, who is the mushroom priestess. And her work was really the thing that brought this to our Western society, not by her own choice, but that's a whole other story. She called them the little saints and
The
felt
little
that they
saints.
connected us so much to the divine.
That's interesting.
And yeah, it is interesting. And I think that for me, while I had been on a spiritual journey for several years before I began eating mushrooms, when I began eating mushrooms, it was like everything just made so much sense. And I could see that I am myself divine. I am made in her image. And even though I had all of this religious trauma from my upbringing,
Right.
like there was finally within me this open expansiveness and oneness that was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, I love
Yeah.
myself and here we are.
And that's important. We love ourselves and learn to love
Yeah.
ourselves and we, in order to even help somebody else, we need to love ourselves first. In that regard, for all those caretakers that are still out there that are working as a caretaker,
Mhm.
I understand that journey as well. But you get to learn to love yourself as well. Um, what's the difference between? Because I know that I've had conversations on the program about with ashwagandha. What's the
Ashwagandha or
ayahuasca?
ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca. Excuse
Yeah.
me. Yeah, ayahuasca. Thank you for correcting me. Let me try that
Mhm.
again. Can I do take another take?
Yeah.
Take. Let me mark that one. Ayahuasca. What's the difference between ayahuasca and the psychedelic mushroom?
So the main difference, well, there are several. The way that you ingest it is different. Ayahuasca is actually a combination of a couple of different parts of plants, and it is very much a form of DMT, whereas psilocybin turns into psilocin in the body. But the way that it feels, and I'm not someone who's actually sat with ayahuasca, but my clients and the research and my teachers, the way that it feels and the place that it takes you can be similar. But from what I understand, ayahuasca is a longer trip. It's usually done overnight. You drink an ayahuasca tea. You can drink a tea with psilocybin too, or you can eat just the dried fruiting body, the mushroom caps or stems. And the places that you go, I think, I really think it's all taking us to the same place. I think that just like, religion and spiritual tools and different modalities, I tend to believe that psychedelics, no matter which ones you're working with, because there are so many, if you're on a path to self discovery, that's where it's going to take you. And sure, it might take you to a bunch of different places to sightsee first. And sometimes those might be places that you don't want to go. But in the end, I think they're going to get you closer to knowing who you are and knowing what's been holding you back. Ayahuasca is a deeply indigenous practice that is becoming more and more popular. There are lots of places in South and Central America where you can go and drink ayahuasca and sit in ceremony with actual shamans. I know Peru is a big one, and it's legal in those places. The same is going on with psilocybin. So we've seen several states here in the United States shift their laws. There are also countries that have either decriminalized or made these medicines legal. And then still here in the States, there are other psychedelic medicines like peyote and iboga that are being used sometimes legally, depending on which often Native American group you're working with. And so that's kind of, I think, the difference. A psilocybin full dose trip is usually 4 to 6 hours. Ayahuasca, I believe, is usually 6 to 8. And ayahuasca comes with a lot of purging often, which is puking and possibly pooping. And the other big psychedelic substance that a lot of folks would be very familiar with is LSD. And it is a synthesized psychedelic, so meaning that it doesn't grow naturally. But that has the longest general trip, where we're talking like 8 or more hours.
Yeah, sometimes I know LSD, just from my understanding it from a personal perspective, not taking it, but dealing with individuals that had taken it years and years ago,
Yeah.
and it showed back up in a trip, and obviously they called 911 and so forth, and we had come to them. I don't know if that same thing would happen with mushroom or same thing would happen with ayahuasca, but it's interesting to understand that these type of things are available within and from Mother Nature, and to give us a better connection with the universe, in whatever form that you feel that journey is going to take you. I The way you're talking about all this is really interesting. I have a Quest, MetaQuest. This is not an endorsement for MetaQuest, but I do have one that I started using. And they have a program on there called Trip, TRIPP, and
Okay.
it reminds me of what I think would be a trip. You get all these
Hmm.
kaleidoscope things and colors and stuff floating around, and I meditate with that. It really brings peace to me, actually,
Yeah.
which I'm sure that this probably would do the same thing. They're doing some studies here in Arizona in regard to the magic mushroom, and the
Hmm.
state legislature is trying to kind of shut it down, unfortunately. And did a big thing on it the other day. There's a reason I asked you in specific. The thing that they were doing the other day was an expose on the facility that's you doing it legally. They have a grant, they've got permission to do it, and et cetera, but they're trying to shut it down.
Hmm.
And they're dealing a lot with, again, with PTSD with soldiers, especially. And in regard to helping them to overcome their PTSD, their anxiety, their depression, and everything associated with coming back from a war zone,
Yeah.
from that, and the advantages and the people that they were speaking with. This just validates a little bit more of what you were talking through. People said that it changed their lives immensely. They were at such a level of depression and anxiety and PTSD that anything would set them off.
Hmm.
And they've come to a better understanding and can function on a regular daily basis when they've partaken into this study that they were doing, and with the microdosing with the psilocybin, which is, I
Yeah.
think, is an amazing, it's just amazing. Um,
And I think before we move on, I think another thing that is really important, and I love that we're having these studies. We're studying them in Texas too. Um, no matter if you're in a study or you're going to a ceremony space, I think that these beautiful experiences that I'm telling you about were for me achieved because I had support and I had a
yeah.
teacher or I had a guide. And so I don't want you guys to listen to this and think that you can just go find mushrooms, eat them, and have like a beautiful trip. You might, and you might have an incredibly challenging experience too. And I
Yeah.
think that, you know, some folks who might be self-medicating, like we know millions of people are ingesting these medicines even though it is still illegal in a lot of places. They're self-medicating.
Mhm.
And that's why so much of my mission is safe harm reduction education. um, and so yeah, I just wanted to make sure we said that too.
I
And the other
appreciate that.
thing, yeah, the other thing about PTSD that I found so interesting when I was diagnosed, one, I had no idea that I could get PTSD because I'm like, well, nothing really bad has happened.
Mm.
But there's also secondary PTSD, which is definitely what I had because I had watched the worst things you can think of. Like the things that you see on TV that you think are terrible, who blurs that out? Us. Like journalists blur that out. And like the amount of horrific stuff I heard, the straw that like broke my back and led me to leave or take a sabbatical from
Mm.
TV was the Uvalde school shooting here in Texas, which
Yeah.
happened like 2 hours from where I live. 19 elementary school children were murdered, as well as their two teachers. And like the things that we heard and saw during that coverage was just completely just heartbreaking. But what I think is also really important to know is that when we look statistically, women have PTSD much more than anyone else. And so
Mm.
these studies are looking at the PTSD that we talk about so often, which is in veterans, which is in police officers, which is in fire and first responders. And I think that sometimes because so much of the media focuses on those people and their PTSD, that women who have it potentially even more statistically based on the violence done on them,
Mhm.
they don't realize that they also have PTSD. And so their PTSD manifests in ways that aren't the same. They're not lashing out and angry or hurting people. They might be numbing out with alcohol. They might be just, having difficulty parenting.
Yeah.
And I think that that's for me what's been so wonderful to notice and to see is how moms specifically are benefiting from working with magic mushrooms. They're becoming more patient. They are feeling like themselves again. They aren't having to drink half a bottle to a bottle of wine at night after their kids go to sleep because they just can't cope. They're able to be vibrant, loving, connected parents and partners. And so many of them who I work with and those who I've spoken with credit magic mushrooms for bringing that to them. So it's
I agree with
interesting.
that. Yeah, I'm glad that you really kind of delved a little more deeper into that. That's the reason whenever I talk about PTSD, I emphasize that it doesn't happen to just cops and firefighters and soldiers and EMTs, et cetera. It can happen to anyone and at different levels and for various reasons in regard to that. And if you have an event like that that is affecting you, I'll also leave some resources in the show or in the show notes that people can reach out to if you're experiencing that. Not only can they reach out to you, but I'll leave some stuff that they can reach out to someone else as well, because it is detrimental and it can be extremely detrimental to not only themselves but to those around them, and I think it needs to be addressed. So thank you. Help us understand it, and I'm going to mess this word up again. I know that I am, and I want to do the best I can. Cyclical living and womb reconnection. Can you help us understand what that is and how we, those individuals that want to work through that, have an opportunity to do so?
Yeah. So cyclical living simply means living in tune with your menstrual cycle or in tune with maybe the moon cycle. It's often a deeply intuitive practice that allows you to really start to understand your feminine hormones and understand how to work with those hormones in a way that is beneficial for your entire life. So the thing is, the world is set up for male hormones, which are very stable day after day after day. Most have a 24-hour hormone cycle if you are born in a male body. Whereas women and people who have periods, our hormone cycle is not the same day after day. We are much more like the moon in that we flow through these phases over about a 28-day cycle, or however long your personal menstrual cycle happens to be. Mine's a little bit longer. And so when I started to understand my menstrual cycle, I could understand how sometimes I felt great and sometimes I felt terrible, and what I could do to support myself no matter where I fell in that cycle. And so I really think that cyclical living is more for people who, like I said, have had a menstrual cycle, who identify as women. And I think that you can work with your cycle even if you're past menstruating age. And in that way, I think you would be working with more moon type work or more earth-based connective spirituality, because I really see cyclical living as a spiritual practice. Now, womb reconnection for me was what actually helped me understand my cycle. When I first got off of hormonal birth control, I tried to masculine my menstrual cycle by doing everything right. Of course I did. I had all the charts. I had all of the special supplements, and I was seed cycling, and I was working out for my cycle, too much. Absolutely information overload. And my period did not come back for 9 months. And finally, what I began to do was understand the womb itself, doing some womb massage, doing some meditations, envisioning into the womb itself. And I think that everyone can benefit from womb work, whether you have a womb or not. So those born in male or female bodies, because we all came from the womb. And womb work, I believe, is this practice that deeply connects us to our center, our power source, our creativity, and our life force energy. Because like I said, we came from this womb. We may have wounds from being in utero. I know I do because of my birth and adoption story. But we can have wounds that are transported and transmitted to us ancestrally and generationally, even when we are tiny little babies floating around inside of the dark womb of our mother, that I think we can benefit from. And that's why I think we can benefit from doing this womb work.
Do you think womb work is, I just introduced to this about a year and a half ago, intergenerational trauma. Does that follow us through from the womb throughout?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think that there are many different ways that we can, I don't even know what the right word would be. There's lots of different ways we get generationally traumatized. But I believe that in utero is a huge one. And I did a long, about 6-month study last year on somatic trauma therapy. And one of the people who are really at the forefront of this, Peter Levine, talks about this in his book, Waking the Tiger, that like in utero trauma is some of the very first and most like impactful trauma, because it's also like we're not going to remember that consciously unless you do some psychedelics, and then maybe you will. But it's like one of those things where so many things can impact us when our mother's stress levels are increased. Like I'll share my personal story. So I was adopted. My birth mother was 12. And so I only found this out when I met her. But she was basically kicked out of her home when her mom found out that she was pregnant, even though she was a child and even though she had been molested. But she had to leave her home. She was fortunate enough to find like a foster family situation through the adoption agency she decided to choose. And still, it turned out the best case scenario. Obviously, I was adopted and she was able to go to a state school away from the abuse. But I never could understand how I'd had such a good life, but I felt so much like constantly like the other shoe was going to drop. I was always worried. I was always so in my scarcity. And I felt constantly like I had to achieve in order for someone to love me. Well, what I've noticed through the work that I've done with psychedelics and my own womb, and an incredibly transformative journey where I ate some mushrooms and then like saw myself in the womb, was that basically I had these wounds inside me because of all of the things she was experiencing and all of the things that she experienced from her mother and her grandmother. Because when you think about how babies are formed, we are actually in our mother when she is in her mother, because of the fact that the ovaries, where the eggs are contained, form while she's in utero inside her own mother. So that means that technically generational trauma is at least 3 generations back, just based on what's happening in the womb.
Well, that's crazy. I mean, it's interesting. I never thought about it from that perspective. I learned about intergenerational trauma, I say a couple of years ago. I had to go back and look at my notes, but yeah, about 2.5 years ago, actually. And it started making a whole lot of sense in regard from my own experiences. I started kind of understanding a little more in depth of how far back that had gone. But coming from what you just said, that even makes more sense to me, actually, because my mother came from a very abusive situation within herself. And now we're going to get off this conversation and I'm going to be out there having a cup of tea going, and really start going a little more deeper within regard to that. I mean, she's deceased now, so I can't even ask, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting. You just opened.
Yeah, I know. Just opened a whole Pandora's box of trauma. Sorry about that. But I think what's interesting is you don't necessarily have to know what's happened in order to begin to heal. And I think that, especially when it comes to generational trauma and ancestral trauma, sometimes things start to show up in your life that don't make sense as to why that would be mine. And that was my thing, right? I'm like, I had a really loving family. I had, we didn't have a lot of money, but we had enough. And yet from the age of 5 and 6, I remember being terrified my dad was going to die and we were going to be homeless because we lived in the church's house. And I would just have these like spirals at night. That was childhood anxiety. Yeah. And it's like, whose was this? And I think now what I've really come to understand is that was most likely the insane amounts of cortisol my birth mother was experiencing when I was about 6 months inside. She was about 6 months pregnant when she even found out she was pregnant, because she had everything was turned on its head, so much upheaval. And then I was in a foster home for a month after I was born, before I was adopted. And who knows what happened at that
Yeah.
point. So I think sometimes even, now as adults and as folks who are on this path, if you start to notice things that don't really make sense, like, what is this? Is it mine? Is it something society has put on me? Is this ancestral? Like, those can also be really interesting little paths to start looking at through. Maybe it's therapy for you. Maybe you want to start and go that way. Maybe it's psychedelic medicine. Maybe it's some other form of healing. But it's just so fascinating to be a human, right? And to be able to be an awakened human who's aware of all of these fascinating things that happen to us.
Well, and I think it also emphasized the fact that, the at least what I've become to learn is that we're all connected, and that our souls are all connected. And, that just shows to me, at least from my perspective, I think that shows that there's a deeper connection to that soul connection. And that's why it kind of carries it forward, I think, because, I think, we can, my mind is spinning. It's going all over the place. So about 3:00 tomorrow morning, I'm going to call you and say, hey,
Yeah, do it.
Just figured this out.
But I think
Go ahead.
one thing I'd love to say is that I think that that's another reason why psilocybin specifically is such a wonderful healer, because what you just said, if you haven't yet had the aha moment that we are fully one, I encourage you to explore these mushrooms, because when we look at the mycelium network that we know runs beneath the soil, and it's the reason why plants can talk to each other and trees share nutrients, and the foundation of that is psilocybin. Literally, it's all connected. And then when we understand that we are all one, I think this is why they're actually illegal, because if we all knew we were one, we wouldn't be doing war, we wouldn't be controllable. Then I think that we can understand that, like, some of the things we experience aren't the end of the world as we think they might be. We can love our fellow man more, we can love ourselves more, and we can take care of the planet. But I think that it's just so fascinating, like the structural part, like this, and that's just,
Right.
the way that they grow. Like, that's not even that spiritual, like that woo. It's just the way they grow, and it's just so fascinating.
Well, and that's something that I'm glad you mentioned, the thing about the interconnection in underground, is that they have found that mushrooms are all, no matter in a whole wide forest, they have found mushrooms that were growing that were connected underground to all these other ones everywhere, which I think is kind of very unique as Mother Nature at work in full force.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you're a certified menstrual cycle coach. We just talked about that. A psychedelic guide, which we talked about. The female embodiment mentor, which obviously the whole conversation has been about making sure that, you out there as a female individual have the power within yourself to make change, and the power within yourself to choose and to make your own decisions, and to become the better person that you want to become, or become the person that you want to become, without the help of anybody else or somebody stopping you. But I have to ask you this, because as you know from my podcast, and you just listened to one episode, let's talk about witch.
Yeah, let's
Please.
talk about it. So I think for me, saying that I'm a witch first and foremost was like because I really wanted to be controversial. I was like, it was just like double middle fingers, because I was like,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
But what I think it means for me is a woman in total control of herself, a woman who is sovereign, who understands her cycles, who listens to the rhythm of her womb and understands the language of her internal environment. I'm not someone who practices magic. And I love that the conversation you had just reposted that I listened to this morning was talking about this wonderfully inclusive term of witch, because you don't have to practice magic in order to claim this moniker. For me, it's really about that self-sovereignty and understanding that I am made in God's image, and God looks like me to me, right? Whereas the God of my childhood was a sky daddy who like was kind of scary.
Yeah.
You know? So that I think is one of the reasons why I've really gravitated toward acknowledging my witchiness. It's certainly talking about things we don't talk to my parents about. We never talk about that. And I think that's okay. I think that for me, this path has made me happier and made me more whole than anything I have experienced in my life. And I think that my certain path of witchcraft looks very different, I think, than what most folks like might think of. I'm very, like I was telling somebody else the other day, like my magic is my cycle.
Right.
I practice cyclical magic. I practice magic specific to my period, blood magic. And I think that those elements further connect me to my feminine energy and my empowerment. And that's sort of how I found myself in this term of witch.
Well, and I think we all deserve that opportunity to be able to do that for ourselves as well. And so it's a wonderful, that conversation that you were talking about. I'll make reference to, if you don't mind, I'll make reference to in the show notes in regards to people coming back and listen to it as well, so that it gives a connection to what you just said. But yes, it is. I think that we all have the magic within ourselves. Magic can be real. Magic can be, an illusion, but magic can also be felt within ourselves and make those connections with Mother Earth and another soul. Mm-hmm. To me, that's magic as well. We wake up every morning and we breathe. That's magic. We, I can hug my daughter. I can hug my wife. That's magic. I can love them. I can receive that love that's magic. In my opinion, having conversations like this, I believe, is magic, because the universe brought us together for a reason, and it brought us together to have a conversation like this that we can share with other individuals across the universe. And to me, that's magic. Mm-hmm. So I think we all have a little witch inside us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not lost on me that I feel so much magic, and I work with magic mushrooms, and I'm, I think maybe that's my entire purpose, is to just find the magic and help awaken your magic too.
And that works. That definitely works. I like that. If we can, excuse me, it's another advantage of Ecamm. You can mark these so you can edit easy.
Love it.
I'm still getting over a chest cold. I'm done with it now, I hope, but I still have a little bit sneaks back in there. Back to business. I know that you offer coaching and you offer a retreat, a sanctuary, and you have a podcast. Can we talk a little bit about that and what you offer and how we can get in touch with you?
Yes, of course. So if you're watching this and you are seeing some wonderful graphics Michael put up. So yes, I have a podcast called The Light Within, which is where we speak about things that light me up. So spirituality, sexuality, wellness, and empowerment. I also have a few self-paced courses to either help you connect with your cycle or begin a mindful microdosing practice. And the thing that I'm really pouring so much energy and love into right now is my new online community for mystical women, The Sanctuary, which is a special sacred place for us to awaken our power, our pleasure, and our purpose through communing with sacred mushrooms. And like you said, I also work one-on-one. So if you're listening to this and you feel maybe this is the sign that you want to invite magic mushrooms into your life, but you've got questions, I would love for you to either hit the link in the show notes or find me on social media at Leslie Draffin and just send me a message with the word hope. I feel like there is so much hope for you on your healing journey, even if you feel really stuck right now. And maybe magic mushrooms and somatic practicing, resourcing is the next step for you. So we can connect. And then for everything else, I have a website. It's just lesliedraffin.com, 2 Fs. And I would love to meet you and connect and whether we work together or not, be there for you as a support as you go on this journey back to yourself.
Outstanding. And I'll make sure all those are in the show notes as well so that they have an unique opportunity just to click it and it'll be there. I appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. I think that I could talk to you for another hour. It seems like this hour went really quick. So you'll have to come back on because I think that there's so many more things that you can share in your wisdom and your experiences that would help inspire, motivate, and educate people. That's my mantra, I guess, my methodology, my hope is that we can do that. I think we've done that today. And I want to thank you for sharing that journey with us. And I look forward to having another conversation with Rhoda. This is one more thing before you go. So before we go, do you have any words of wisdom?
You are the medicine and you're the magic. And the other side is just waiting for you to step into it.
You are the medicine, you are the magic is brilliant. It's brilliant words of wisdom. Leslie, thank you very much again. I really appreciate you coming on the show. It was a pleasure to meet you, and what an amazing journey to where you're at today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Michael.
And for everyone else out there, please make sure that one more thing before you all go, have a nice day, have a nice week, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go. Check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.